Hello everyone, welcome back. To you who might be new, I'm glad you're joining us. This is an exploration into where we're at currently in terms of global affairs and what might be the outcome of what I think anyway are clear signals of a major rupture. Rupture is really sudden. It is not randomness. It is not an unforeseeable black swan. Rupture is what happens when accumulated systemic weight exceeds institutional capacity. To demonstrate that, and in a way also to confirm it, what I want to do in this particular talk is firstly identify the signals of at least 3 preceding historical ruptures, and I've covered those before. From those 3, to identify common structural indicators, and then thirdly, using those indicators, go and compare them to measurable stress signals currently. To do the contemporary assessment, I'm going to be relying on major global reports. So, as I've said in the previous slide, rupture is the visible release of accumulated stress. Before every rupture, signals exist, data exists, and warnings exist. The system does not collapse without telegraphing some degree of strain. My assumption is if we can identify those signals early, we will be better able to manage its effects. We start with the first of our known ruptures, the Neolithic rupture. The events that drove that was the shift from foraging to settlement/agriculture. I put settlement/agriculture because there's debate about whether it was settlement first and then agriculture, or agricultural first and settlement then. Although there seems to be more evidence emerging that some form of settlement preceded agriculture, and that agriculture, and this is interesting for those of you like myself who are interested in settlement formation, would place significant emphasis on the influencing role that settlement has outside of itself. So we do know that agriculture did not appear overnight. It was a process. We suspect that what happened is that hunting returns declined. This is just after the Ice Age. That semi-sedentary settlements formed in pockets where wild grains were successful, were plentiful. And in an effort to ensure a steady supply of food, storage practices expanded. Ritual architecture also begins to emerge almost simultaneously, partly to ritualize identity, and partly in response to understanding a rather tenuous existence with the environment and a belief that there were external forces at play, and therefore if some kind of relationship could be established with those external forces that were supportive, the risks of environmental, or more particularly food shortages and collapse, would be minimized. But essentially, agriculture was the resolution of accumulated ecological and demographic strain. The following rupture that I've identified is the Westphalian rupture. This is the Peace of Westphalia formalized during the middle 1600s. But there were already signs of breakage prior to 1648. What we saw was the fragmentation of authority, particularly within the church and the ruling classes. A major impact by the introduction of the printing press and the making available of knowledge, and the inability to continue with extensive military action and its impact on the fiscus. So the treaty did not actually cause rupture. What it did do was codify its aftermath. The next example of rupture is the industrial rupture, one perhaps that we are more familiar with, where the events are shift from the agrarian economy towards essentially fossil fuel-based capitalism. One wants to put it as bluntly as possible. But even here there are signals. We see that wood energy is insufficient to continue supporting the society. We see urban congestion intensifying. We're seeing financial systems maturing, going back to the 1600s, before steam became scalable. And so what this rupture did was release store energy, both non-renewable, buried energy, but also institutionally around capital concentration and scientific technical accumulation. We can then look at these three ruptures and try to find the commonalities. And there are 7. We see carrying capacity strain. We see institutional mismatch. We see information acceleration. We see surplus concentration, identity fragmentation, prolonged disequilibrium, and emergent parallel systems. That's the last one that I find really, really interesting. So we can take those 7, which are common to the 3 ruptures we've covered, and go and test them against where we're at the moment. Today, the data is a lot more plentiful, a lot more accessible. So when we look for signals, we don't need to actually look too far. Probably the easiest place to start is the global goals for sustainable development. There are 17 indicators. Each one, in fact, is an indicator of a systemic failure, whether it's poverty, hunger, health, education, gender equality. You can go through these one by one. They are there because they have been identified as a global challenge, and that if left unattended are going to create existential risks. Also put them into a more kind of familiar pattern: economic, environmental, social, institutional stress. So if we do that and we just start with the economic strength, what we see globally is growth slowing structurally, financial conditions around the world remaining tight, debt burdens remain elevated, and this is not a singular shock. It is a prolonged fragility. If you want to find that indicator match to the previous ones, it's in the carrying capacity strain. Our economies cannot sustainably keep our populations going at levels that we would desire. And you'll see it in institutional lag. Environmentally, this is perhaps the one that is most clearly identifiable, is a result of structural overshoot. Extraction exceeds replenishment. The planetary boundary framework, which most of you will be familiar with, indicates systemic destabilization, with 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries already breached. And you can go look to any number of other reports, UNEP studies, etc. Just 2 headlines. We're in a stage where 9 million pollution-related deaths occur annually, and currently $45 trillion of annual environmental damage is occurring. And this has been ongoing for a period, and indicators would suggest that there is no immediate solution for them going forward. This mirrors essentially the Neolithic carrying capacity strain, but not at a community level any longer, at a planetary scale. So the indicator match to the previous 7 is this metabolic overload. The system is so hungry, it needs so much feeding that there are not sufficient resources to keep it going. Societal stress, if we go back to the triple bottom line approach, is another one where evidence is clearly available. 3.5 billion people below the middle income threshold worldwide. Extreme poverty reduction, the rate of extreme poverty reduction is stagnating, so we are not making any progress in diminishing those rates. Polarization intensifies, identity fragmentation is visible, particularly in those 3 critical areas. We try to understand ourselves. It is around the I, who am I? What is my purpose? Where do I belong? It is the we, and that starts at the family unit, stretches up to the community level, to the village level, to the city level, to the national level. Who are we? And then the most problematic one is the they. The one that creates the biggest divide is the they. And we've seen that play itself out historically in wars and conflicts. But it's also currently the driver for much of the social stress, for example, in the USA. The indicator match here to the 7 is that social coherence weakening under stress. And an indicator that needs to be included into the triple bottom line is institutional stress, where currently institutions are designed for industrial growth and now have to begin to engage with governing planetary constraint. That's a mismatch. That's not their function. That's not what they are constituted to do. Multilateral systems show coordination fatigue. It's one of the reasons why the Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Development Goals before that show so little progress. It's one of the reasons why we see so little progress in climate change negotiations and any number of others. So the indicator match here that reflects the previous 3 ruptures is institutional mismatch. Institutions that are poorly geared to solving particular problems. There are some other matches outside of that triple bottom line that we can look at, which originate in previous ruptures, particularly the Westphalian one. Information acceleration in the digital era, where the printing press destabilized medieval authority. Currently, digital networks have the ability to destabilize liberal democracies. Information velocity exceeds the ability of governments to absorb that information and to deal with it. So information acceleration is a very powerful current indicator. Another previous indicator from the 7 is this prolonged disequilibrium. In previous ruptures, disequilibrium persisted before transition. Depending how you want to look at this, we are now 15 plus years into compounding instability. Probably goes back further than that if you want to. You can probably take it back to post-Second World War, certainly into the 50s and definitively into the 60s, where we have seen prolonged systemic imbalance. And people like Rachel Carson and Kingsley Davis in the environmental and social fields beginning to raise the alarm about those impacts. This is one I find fascinating, the parallel structures emerging. So what we see previously is before rupture, alternative forms begin to develop in parallel to what is happening. And a classic case here is the parallel form of energy generation taking place, for example, in South Africa, where previously we had Eskom as a state enterprise solely in charge of energy generation and distribution. Now every single building owner is the owner of a power station, essentially. So a wonderful example of parallel forming, alternatives forming. Energy just is a very visible one, but you will start seeing signs in other areas as well. Before industrialization, it occurred, and we'll see it again. So this is a rather full slide, and I'm not going to take up your time with going through every single cell. But on the left-hand side, under the indicators, are the 7 that were identified from previous rupture events. And then we go through the Neolithic, Westphalian, Industrial, and you can look at today's of actually the ones that are important. Carrying capacity strain, planetary boundaries are breached, right? Not at a local level, not at a city level, not at a national level, at a planetary level. Institutional match, we have national institutions that are trying to deal with global risks outside of their scope. Information acceleration, we enter a scenario of digital hyperconnectivity. Surplus concentrations, all the way from stored grain to financial and technical concentrations. Identity fragmentation, increased polarization and nationalism, a major driver of the outcome of the US elections in the last round. Prolonged disequilibrium from 2008 at the very least to today. We've seen these cascading crises. As I said a little bit earlier, you could probably take that back to the 50s. And parallel structures emerging, not just at an energy level, but it now suddenly at regional blocks beginning to form as alternatives to what were global institutions. So that then begs the question, is this managed transition? Are we actually managing this? Or is it cascade? We need to understand rupture is not fate. There's nothing that determines it has to happen. It happens as a consequence. It is a threshold crossing when the systems are just unable to deal with the pressures. That being said, it would suggest that institutions that anticipate stress can redesign their systems to cope with it. On the other hand, Those that deny the signals and continue relying on the same approach, which is how they landed up where they are anyway, will probably face collapse. Essentially, the outcome depends on adaptation speed. That requires an adaptive capacity, willingness to adapt, and B, rapid response. I like to use the metaphor of riding a wave of a surfer. The surfer has no control over whether the wave that's going to come is a surfable wave or not. No control. The surfer simply has to anticipate, and that would be based on the surfer's knowledge of that location, when is that really good wave going to come? Number one, anticipation, and B, I'm going to ride it. That's the response. We don't have any control over the rupture. The signs are that it's occurring. All we can do is decide, are we going to bail or are we going to ride it? It's not a black swan. It is a predictable consequence of ignoring accumulated systemic weight. And the signals we've seen are visible. Like the surfer, the question is whether we recognize them before the release phase.